Good afternoon and welcome everyone. Welcome to this conversation with Kay Scary from the People's Supper and Cassandra Lawrence from the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign on the topic of dinner dialogues as a model for community building during Ramadan and beyond. If you don't know already, my name is Nina Fernando and I serve as the executive director of the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign. Shoulder to Shoulder is a multi-faith coalition with 36 national member organizations and denominations, all committed to addressing, countering, and preventing anti-Muslim discrimination within their communities and the United States. Simply put, we believe that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim discrimination is a dehumanizing effort, and the work of dismantling anti-Muslim hate cannot and should not fall on Muslims alone. That's why Shoulder to Shoulder exists. And we believe that you don't have to be an expert on any topic to recognize and respect the human dignity of another person. No matter your background, whether you think about this work all the time, every day, or you're just getting started, we're really grateful you're here and joining us for this conversation, tuning in live, or even watching the recording later. Before we begin, and I pass it over to our speakers, Cassandra and Kay, and I want to give a shout out to Becca from our team too, that's helping here with the back end. I want to just share a quick note on harassment. In this work, we call upon each of us to treat each other with compassion and honesty, and to foster an ethical commitment to bedrock American values such as pluralism and religious freedom, mutuality, respect, values at the core of many of our faith traditions. This includes both online and offline spaces, and we request that everyone treat each other with dignity and respect, upholding life, avoiding misinformation. We won't always agree, but we can commit to holding space where we can disagree while respecting each other's humanity. So we reserve the right to remove participants that don't uphold these standards, but we don't think that will happen today, and we encourage everyone to keep these guidelines in mind during this event. So again, so glad you all are here, and passing it to you, Cassandra and Kay.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Nina. Hi, my name is Cassandra Lawrence, and I'm the Communications and Community Engagement Manager for Shoulder to Shoulder. I've been with our organization for a little over 5 years. In my work, not only do I manage our communications channels, I also help manage our 72 plus local organizations, synagogues, congregations, all committed to addressing anti-Muslim discrimination in some capacity. Now, this includes book groups, congregations, Muslim Jewish groups, university groups, coalitions addressing hate, and interfaith organizations. So it's quite a broad range. And in many of these member organizations and in many of the communities, we have used or participated in some version of a dialogue centered around sharing and eating food together. Many of our religious traditions have spaces built into our regular rhythms of life that make this even more possible, whether that's a Seder, an Iftar, a Suhoor, if you're really brave and you want to get up at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, like an Easter brunch. There's all kinds of ways to engage in conversation and food. And having conversations while sharing a meal is like a fundamentally human way to connect. And unfortunately, our culture has deemed specific topics as taboo, and worse, has deemed certain people as unwelcome. And so during the month of Ramadan, the Shoulder to Shoulder campaign hosts the United States of Love Over Hate. This is a Ramadan supper series, which the primary goal of this effort is to identify, support, and connect people to iftars that are open to interfaith guests across the nation. Now, an iftar, if you don't know, is the meal that breaks the fast at the end of the day, every day during Ramadan. And we connect people to these meals in order to help facilitate those local relationship building among Muslims and people of other faiths, cultures, and backgrounds, and people of no faith at all. People that are their neighbors, their teachers, doctors, bus drivers, all kinds of things. And so in that work, we decided to reach out to our colleagues and friends at the People's Supper to design a guidebook. And our first guidebook we designed several years ago, and we revisited that guidebook this year and re-released it to set the table for intentional conversations that will deepen our understanding and relationships with each other. And so I'm really excited to have this conversation with Kay. Kay and I are good friends as well as colleagues, and Kay is the Director of Partnerships at the People's Supper. So I want to just get us started. Let's dive right in. Kay, can you share a little bit about the People's Supper, what they do, what's the model, like how do you explain what the People's Supper is and why it's important?
Absolutely. Thank you, Cassandra. It's so good to be with you all. I'm excited to dig in. The People's Supper, People's Supper by design is simple and familiar because we hope that it's kind of a practice that gives us something when we're inviting folks to kind of share their stories and be vulnerable with each other. We've designed kind of a model that isn't novel, that is really easy to access, that's clear, so that people know kind of, at least I have this thing I can make sense of when I might be invited to sit into kind of some discomfort in the conversation with one another. And so, we think about the People's Supper being kind of a small group of maybe 8 people, maybe up to 10 at a table with a trained peer facilitator who can just hold conversation well, who can pose. We usually pick 3 questions ahead of time that are intended to really crack conversation open and get us talking about the things that might be the most pressing things for us to be in dialogue about, but might be also the things that we're really apt to kind of to silo around or to not share with each other. I think often about the ways that we always see people's landing place, and we don't always have the opportunity to see all the reasons, stories, experiences that propelled them to show up in the ways that they do. And so the People's Supper is trying to create space for that type of deeper story sharing, of getting the story behind the story. And so again, kind of a shared meal. And we get a lot of questions around how important a meal is. And I love the kind of familiarity and the chance to share a meal with other people, but we've done people's snacks, we've done people's coffee and teas. So we use a meal, but really what we're trying to do is create the conditions for trust building and story sharing for folks to just get to know one another differently, to complicate the narrative of each other, to build deeper trust with each other.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's something that I feel like every person on this call has probably engaged in some version of a dinner dialogue or a meal dialogue. Some of my favorite ones are some friends and I decided to put together interfaith iftars that were designed for young adults who often don't, like, if you go to a lot of interfaith iftars, it's mostly panels speaking from the front of the room, which are lovely and great and have a lot of beautiful things to say. And as young people, we just wanted to get to know each other. Mm-hmm. And so we rented this back room in a coffee shop, and we brought picnic blankets and put them on the floor. It was carpeted, so we just put it on the floor, and then we sat around and had our food and had conversations on picnic blankets in the back of a coffee shop with some guided conversation.
I love that. Yeah, I think there's something about the opportunity to just go a little deeper together and how instructive it can be to realize, I think I grew up in a community that was really diverse. Like, I grew up in a place that was had a lot of people from all different cultures. And so I always thought that that must mean I was culturally competent in some ways. And I went to college in a pretty homogenous town. And I remember being really struck by when people would learn about the place I grew up and the cultures some of my friends were from, they would ask me these questions that I never thought to ask myself. It was such an instructive thing for me about the ways that proximity isn't always enough, that we have to be able to get curious about each other too, and be willing to ask good questions, to consider all that we might not know, to consider that proximity might actually just lead to some really to sharpening our own assumptions, instead of really taking the time to ask good questions, to get to really build some good relationships. And so that's been deeply instructive for me, is kind of, how do you create spaces by which, even if we are working alongside each other in our employment places, or we're neighbors, or all these things, how do we create spaces by which we can ask ask about one another and really get to know one another and dig in together.
Yeah, I always love doing different interfaith and intercultural work. I always love the questions people ask me, like things that I had never considered. Like, Cassandra, does that bread, like I'm Christian, does that bread, do you really think it becomes the body of Christ? And I'm like, well, would you like a theological treatise? Or a really simple answer? Because most people don't want the 300-year, 5, 7, 1200-year history of
Really.
Christian theological thought around communion. They just want to know, like, what is it? How does it make you feel? Like, how, like, what is the importance of it? Or at least most people do. Some people want the theological history.
Yeah, but I think you're hitting on something important there too, because even I also think there's other ways to learn those theological histories than to ask to get to know one another, and there's something about it's not just knowing the history, it's knowing how that impacts you, how that shapes and forms you, and how it propels you to show up in the world, or how it impacts kind of your ways of thinking about how to order the rest of our community. And, I think so much of understanding that helps us then to build a really pluralistic society as well. It's like, it's not just about, do you really think the bread becomes the body of Christ? It's like, what does the practice of taking communion form in you? And how does that propel you beyond the communion table into your voting habits, your ways of showing up at work, the way you think about being a neighbor? And those pieces, I think, are the ways that we can do really good work together, and that we can be sharpened by one another. And I think one of the traps I think can happen in some of these dialogues is like, we have people who get nervous that what's happening here is how can we get people to dinner so that we can convince them that our way is the right way of thinking, and I really think about how can we create dinners by which we recognize that we need each other's perspectives. There's not a hierarchy here, but there's limits to my own perspective, my own ways of understanding the world, and I really need other people's too, and I need different ways, and our communities need each other's perspectives to be more whole, and in order to create communities where everyone can flourish, we need everyone to be participants in designing what that might look like. And so I think that's one kind of distinction I think a lot about making is it's not, especially we see this a lot when we gather folks across political lines, especially like, we're not just gathering people to prove that we can be nice and get you and convince you that actually over here we have morality, or we are the ones who have figured this thing out. But there's something in your perspective that complements mine, and together we need one another. And there's limits to that as well. There are certain perspectives I would certainly throw out, just to be very clear. But yeah, I do think there's something about the kind of holding of those things, not as, oh, this is a tension point, we can't agree, but these two perspectives next to each other create a more beautiful community for all of us.
Yeah, and I think even more than that too, there have been studies, including by Harvard Business School, about diverse work groups, that when people come together, like for a meeting, let's say, if they think that everyone is the same, you are preparing less usually for the conversation, because you think there's like an assumption, like you said, of like, we're all on the same page. We all know what we mean when we say iftar. We all know what we mean when we say communion. Like, all these assumptions get made, and then we actually become lazier or don't work as hard to like understand those things. Whereas if we assume that, if we know we're going to come and meet people that are like on the other side of the political spectrum, it's like, okay, I got to like come prepared with like, here's my thing, here's like why, it maybe not prepared to fight, but like prepared to like, to know who I am and what I believe, and then to learn more about what I believe based on your questions. And so it actually, like, the business studies have shown that it actually makes for stronger teams and stronger outcomes. And so it's beautiful, and it's hard, and it makes the communities better.
Yeah, and I think the other thing you said is that's really important is it's also the self-examination piece. I think something that we try to talk a lot about at the People's Supper is what we're not just doing is saying, come and hear someone else's story. Check. Like, there is something really profound about the holding and honoring and witnessing of other people's experience. but it can also be instructive about your own. It's also interesting to kind of be able to do some self-examination work. And that's just as necessary if we're going to build the communities we long to be part of. We have to both be able to hold and witness and honor each other's dignity and experience. And we have to be able to examine our own selves. And I think that's a piece that it's easy to miss, that I think is so key here. And yeah, it's interesting. I was just telling my team this week, I had a conversation Monday where I was talking about a people supper process we're doing with a group of Christian congregations, and some of the leaders of those congregations were asking me really sharp, good, smart questions out of protectiveness of the people in their congregation, as they should. And I noticed myself kind of differently speak to some of the kind of nuances of how we do this. And there's such layers of this work. There's the simplicity of the model, but the nuances of how we actually tend to the particulars of who's going to be in the room, where are we, what's happening culturally, how do all of those things, what's the history that these people might have together or not, and what, how do we kind of create room for all of those things to show up in the conversation. I think if I was meeting with other folks, to your point, that just did dinner dialogues all the time, I'd be like, yeah, we're just going to get some folks together and it'll be meaningful and we'll ask good questions. But there's so much kind of depth that can happen here. And even for us, we have to be in spaces where we're able to language that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in many of the interfaith events during Ramadan, some people may have never walked into a mosque or a synagogue or a church, let alone like knowingly had a conversation, like this guided conversation with people of different religions, politics, no religion, like all these differences. I may never have done this kind of thing. And we often talk like the phrase of like a brave space or a safe space. Like what do these terms mean? I know like we tend to use brave space, and I think that's true for you all too. So just curious, like, what does that mean? Have you seen that work well and not so well?
Yeah, thank you. So, brave space was a language that emerged out of academia in Michigan when they were doing a series of dialogues for students across racial lines. And they used the language of safe space a lot in that series. And they noticed that some of the Black students who were part of the gatherings would say, like, this isn't safe. Like, folks, I'm not safe here. Like you can't guarantee that I'm not going to hear someone say a microaggression or something that does harm here. Like you can't guarantee my safety. And on the flip side, they noticed that some of the white students in the room, when they rubbed up against kind of a moment of real discomfort, would say, whoa, I'm like no longer safe. And so we think a lot about brave space as honoring of the vulnerability it takes to show up in spaces that maybe you've never been to before, the courage it takes to be willing to kind of share your story, to let other people in and to do your own self-examination. And we think a lot about that brave space is not to be conflated with comfortable space. And so might we lean into discomfort together? Might we trust that we can grow there? And I think about, in the particulars of going into religious spaces that maybe you've never been to, I do think culturally there's a little bit of this, in I don't know exactly how I want to say this, you want to bear with me, but when I think about kind of responses to hate, Islamophobia, racism, hate in all of its forms, I think it's easy for people to mark themselves as not the problem if they can articulate that they know something about that other culture or that other religion, and being not part of the problem. Being not the problem is to have really good tools to engage in those spaces, even when we don't know, and to be curious. And I think that distinction is really huge. And I think it can be really hard culturally right now to be able to say, I actually don't know what it's like to be in this person's shoes. I actually don't know if I've ever been a person who's caused harm. I actually don't know as much as I thought, even though I have a Muslim neighbor that I've known my whole life. I actually realize I know nothing about their practice, even though I've spent years priding myself on being a good neighbor. And so I think there's something brave about showing up in spaces you've never been in with a willingness to lean into curiosity. And I also think there's a way to prep for moments like this. I think about, I am a journaler through and through. And so a
Yep.
practice of mine is if I'm walking into a dialogue across lines of difference, I will try in kind of the month before that dialogue or the week, whatever I can, to keep a little notebook with me. And anytime I hear something about race or religion or whatever the thing is I'm walking into, I'll just note it, what it was, and note what happens in my body. And that helps me kind of identify in advance of walking in to a conversation. What are my own patterns? What are my own impulses? And what do those need to be interrupted? And
Yeah.
so for me, I think about as a person who is Christian and white and in the United States, I notice that I carry some shame sometimes when I don't know something about the latest inequity or the latest stats on hate crimes or I want to be culturally competent. And so when I don't know, I notice myself, my impulse is to overcompensate by intellectualizing. And so I'll get loud, not like raise my voice, but take up a lot of space in the conversation around the books I've been reading or the stats. Like, see, I do care. It's this, I notice myself get heightened. And it's important for me to know that patterning before I walk into a space like this, so that in an hour of conversation, I could say something like, hey, I'm noticing that I'm feeling anxious that I actually don't know the answer here, or I'm actually curious here. And instead of trying to prove myself, I'm going to try and get curious. And I think there's something about the commitment to a couple of hours over dinner together that, like, can we, for this contained amount of time, try to show up differently? And so I think about, what's the pre-research we can do, because we are going to see and run into folks from all different identities and cultures. And we can be intentional about noticing our own assumptions in that, and we can pay attention to then how we can set really good intentions about how then might I want to show up if I'm going to an iftar. How might I want to lean into curiosity over the next couple of hours instead, and how might this be an opportunity for me to practice something? And I don't think it hurts to name it, to say, hey, I'm really grateful to be here, and I know that I really am intending to show up as a person who's curious and who's aware of all I might not know here, and I want to learn while I'm in this space. And so that was a long answer, but I do think that's some of what brave space requires, is the willingness to self-examine, to show up differently, to interrupt impulses in order to narrow the gap between kind of our professed values and our lived values, if you will.
Yeah, and I think I appreciate your answer, and it reflects on, especially as two people who often lead these conversations, and as many people on this call will be leading these types of things, the importance of us doing that work and of finding the spaces where we can be the participant and not the leader, so that we can remember what it's like to have that dissonance, to have that, did I just see myself do XYZ? Okay, I did. Let me do some processing on that and call my inner circle of folks that I do that work with. And so I have a circle of friends that we all just check in on each other. And when things get rough or things we're doing that personal reflection work.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I just went to so I started at the People Supper 5 years ago, and I hadn't been to an official People Supper before I joined the staff. And so I just went literally a couple weeks ago to my first one that I was invited to. And I walked in the room and I was like, this is daunting. And I was so surprised by how nervous I was, because I direct this work. I do it all over the country. I'm doing People Suppers many times a month. And I was like, oh, it's daunting. And I know that, but to know it, to feel it is a different thing. And I think the other thing you just hit on is huge, is who's the kind of pod of people you can be learning alongside, and who can continue to help you kind of check your impulses, or check the ways you might, the things you say or do might land beyond what you intend. And I think some of what I appreciate about something that takes work actually in the People Supper is people often get really caught up in we have 2 hours of a meal together. They panic if somebody says something that makes people bristle, or if there's a moment of tension or conflict. And 2 things come up for me in that I think are really important. And one is we need not get so panicked that tension or conflict happens that we can't deal with the tension or conflict itself. Like, it's so normal. It's going to happen. We're going to
Mhm.
have moments that don't feel great and we can move through them. And so we think a lot about how we can give kind of the room of people or the facilitators at a space the tools to move through those things and to name them up front so people know, up front at the beginning of the gathering, where we might say, hey, if this kind of situation arises here, here's how we're going to move through it. So then,
Mhm.
the moving through doesn't feel personal. The other thing, and it gives everybody tool and shared language to do that. But the other thing that's interesting to me about people suppers is that it's almost like there's so much pressure on people, put so much pressure on, like, this time has to be excellent, when actually I think this is kind of a moment of connection in a long game. It's in a continuum. And so
Mhm.
if a week later I notice, I'm like, oh, like, I really am not feeling good about that thing I said, you can call, you can follow up, even if you had a people supper with strangers. There's often a way that you can find a chance to reconnect in the aftermath, especially if you're going to someone's place of worship. Perhaps you send a note, you make a phone call, you stop by with a cup of hot tea, and you just say, like, this has really been lingering with me, this thing I said, and I wanted a chance to unpack it or to gut check if it landed in the way I fear it did. And if it did, I want to be able to course correct. And I think that's so much this work too that gets really lost. Is like, it's not that, like, the dinner itself has to be this contained experience where everything, like, we can respond after the fact. And that's something I think that we try to really tell people a lot, because, again, it's not, you might say something that doesn't go well, or that you might notice someone react to something you said and then not really understand why, and not feel like in the moment you can ask about it, but you can follow up. And so we think a lot about kind of, how do we frame a dinner experience as a chance to practice relating to one another in a particular way, a chance to practice doing our own internal work, and a way of being part of a longer arc of our relationship to one another.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of a training I was in once with some facilitators who were coming from a conflict zone. And one of the things they asked us to reflect on is, what was your first awareness of and definition as a child of what peace looked like?
Mm, mm,
And had you reflect on that a little bit? And then what is your awareness now of what peace looks like?
mm,
And in that, like, reflection, I was realizing how, like, when I was a kid, I thought peace looked like everybody happy, everything controlled and manageable, and everything looking good. Like, there's nobody flying off the handle. Everybody's got, like, the best amount of food. Like, nobody has any trouble with, like, getting to the table, like, whatever it is, there was, like, no problems.
mm, mhm.
But as you grow up, you realize, oh, that's one, not really possible. And two, like, learning that actually you grow to have skills to manage those different, like,
Mhm, mhm,
both every day, like, hiccups to, like, the bigger ones, and you build it as a muscle. And
mhm,
so that you can, like, so then peace became, like, as an adult, I would say peace is like committing to stay at the table as long as you can. Like, you have to protect yourself and, like, make
yeah.
sure that you're safe. And if it's a place that's doing harm to you, you should definitely, like, take care of yourself. And if you're able to be in that space, to commit to try and figure it out,
Mhm,
like, to have the
mhm.
hard conversation and be like, yo, I don't know what to do with this. This is how I feel about this thing that I said, that I realize now
Mhm.
probably didn't land the way that I wanted it to based on your reaction.
Yeah.
And I'm feeling some kind of way about that. And I want to come and apologize to you. And that's my first step, is, like, realizing that something I didn't quite do right. And so to me, like, that's, like, that reflection of, like, peace as a little kid and
Yeah.
peace as an adult, what it looks like, and how, like, this kind of conversations and difference, and, like, learning how to live together, and how to
Mm.
process through injustices and justice and compassion and these types
Mhm.
of things.
Yeah. Yeah. My husband teases me for how often I talk about like the building of the musculature. So I was very excited that that is language you also use, but I think there's something really significant about that metaphor that, I think something that's happening culturally is we don't realize we need tools to do relational work. I think we assume relationships are kind of a natural part of life. And if they're not working out, if there's conflict, then like maybe we're just not supposed to be in relationship to one another. And I think, you know, when culture has shifted to a place where you have access to so many other places to plug in, it's really easy to just choose to disengage. And this might be my unpopular opinion, but I think a lot about I get a lot of questions about cancel culture, and it doesn't really bother me in some ways. Like I do think, as you named, there's a real reason that you should disassociate or disengage with folks. There's real reasons for that that are legitimate and true and should be honored. And I do have a curiosity around if people really felt like they had the tools to move through conflict with each other, to stay in relationship when things got difficult, would cancel culture happen so significantly? Like, does cancel culture really always feel like a choice? Or does it feel like this is my only way forward when this thing happens? And I think about this in religious spaces I'm working in right now is, it's interesting, folks will be sitting next to each other on a weekly basis for years and years and years and years, and assume they know each other, they have tools, or they assume shared passion is enough, like especially in religion, when for a lot of folks, religion is kind of the core of their own sense of self and being and their worldview. If we've been sitting next to each other in our congregation for 30 years, we must share that. And that should be enough to keep us together until it isn't. And then we actually have no way to move through that. And it's kind of like I named earlier, it's the lack of tools. It's also the panic that it's the panic that there even was a conflict when, shouldn't we be above that? I see that sometimes as well. And yeah, I really think the kind of need to have spaces where we're practicing apology, or checking in when we think something might have landed funny, or checking in when we said something that didn't come out how we hoped, or naming when we bristled because of something somebody else said. Like, that practice builds up, like you said, kind of the musculature to be able to stay in relationship. And I think part of what we're hoping to do is create lower the barriers to entry around that by giving people a tool and shared language and framework, so it's a little bit less insurmountable for people who are new to this type of practice.
Yeah. Well, we've been talking, you mentioned a little bit about cancel culture. How has like the model of dinner dialogue shifted as polarization has increased, as like, really as polarization has increased, and also like the what I like to say is like our retreat into our like singular identities. So in conflict studies, we see like a flattening of identities happen in conflict cultures. And so like how have you shifted? How has people supper shifted? How has like the conversation shifted as like things have gotten hotter? Like people are genuinely like, I mean, I don't need to list all the things happening in the news of people like actually being violent towards each other. And so just curious, like how you guys have shifted, if at all.
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I have like some thoughts on how people's asks of us have shifted, or how people's reaction to us has shifted, which feels distinctly different than how we have shifted, although there's shifts in both. I would say, we started after the 2016 election, really, some of the ways we shorthand our origin story is, a lot of us were feeling the acute pain of polarization then, and we were formed out of the belief that we weren't going to argue our way out of this. And so that's kind of one of our lines we use to tell about our origin story. And I think a lot of our internal shifts have come from the continued uncovering of like, what actually will it take to do healing work? And so, initially we were doing these one-off suppers, if you will, where we were training people to host meals in their houses, to do one-time gatherings, and we noticed that there was some folks who were showing up to those as a way of proving they weren't the problem instead of doing that kind of deep relational work. And so that was dissatisfying to us. And so we've shifted and shifted over time. And a lot of our work now looks like languaging it as practice, doing kind of deep partnership with communities, and building oftentimes series of work with people over time. I would say a couple of things. Culturally, the appetite for gathering across political lines is incredibly decreased. In the 2016 election, it was not hard to get people together across political lines, and now it really is. What I think is interesting to me, because I do think there's been a growing belief that association is complicity. And so that's a thing that we sometimes have to overcome. What's interesting about it to me is multiple things. I think a lot of times we sit with communities in the question of like, is the issue here the thing that's presenting, or is it a deeper thing? And a lot of communities we work with, it's actually not politics. It's some other issue that's a rupture, and then the politics make it harder. And so actually, we don't even really need to dig into our political perspectives. We need to get to the thing beneath the thing. The other thing for me is, one thing that we've had to get really sharp in is who's actually not welcome at our tables. And I think we hold kind of two convictions that sometimes conflict. And one is we really believe everyone needs a space to belong. And we also believe that not every table can include every person. And so we often have people who come and they're like, how do I get my most racist aunt to come to this gathering? Because they think this is where they'll change. And we say, you don't. You absolutely don't, because it's really important to be thinking about harm reduction, and really important to think about what spaces can hold what people. And the other thing is, we also often have groups who are kind of one-sided, who will come to us and be like, how do we get those people over there to come to the dinner with us?
Yep.
And often what I end up doing is, like, it doesn't take long to surface like, oh, you all have conflict amongst yourselves as well. Like, it's not just about how we can do this work with the most extreme other. It's how we even amongst ourselves be in good practice that builds us up to then be able to do, it's almost like we're jumping to level 10 when I want to gather with like the person who holds every opposite identity from me, when like I don't even know how to move through conflict with my mom, and so there's sometimes, I think some of the approach we've taken is, who do you already have present, and what's the work for you all to do together? And certainly some of that is to acknowledge together the limits to your own perspective because of the lack of difference in your space, perhaps. But some of it is like, you might need to really start where you are. Like, you might need to start with your own self-examination about, why are we such a homogenous group? And why don't any of us know anybody with these other perspectives? And then that becomes the kind of stepping stones. The other thing I think that's happening kind of culturally that is, I think it's interesting. It kind of mirrors what I described about our early days when people would show up to these dinners as a way of proving they weren't part of the problem. I think people are really looking for metrics as part of proving success. So, and I think that's happening in the philanthropy world a lot, but I think even beyond that, we get news requests for people who are like, tell me the story of the last time you gathered 100 people in a room and 50 were Republican and 50 were Democrat. And like, I just don't think that's an interesting story. I just don't. I think that perpetuates this siloed mentality in so many ways. This like, all we really need to be able to do is get people who identify this way and people who identify this way in a conversation. And who cares what happens in the conversation? If they were all in the room together, what a cool antidote. And so I think there's something to me about, we've shifted how we talk about success in our work. That's not about the metrics of who's in the room. Always, sometimes that's important, but it's not our end goal all the time. And I think that's, that is a little bit of time, a place that we find ourselves in tension with a larger culture who's curious about this work.
Yeah. And it tips to the idea again of building your muscles. And so like, we also don't believe that there is an unreachable audience. Now we believe that me, Cassandra, a vegetarian, interfaithy person, may not be able to reach Steve Bannon or someone who's like on the exact opposite political spectrum, whoever that might be, enter whatever idea you have. I probably am not going to be able to speak to that person because we're so distant. However, the 10% around me might be more different than I realize. And I might be more different than I realize from them. And so like, actually, I can begin that process of learning and growing with the very community around me. And actually, there's more people, more room to move in that space through those relationships and through not just the one-time dinner. Like our previous executive director used to say, you know, she doesn't believe that one dinner, one time is going to change everything, but we can't change anything if we don't have relationships with each other, to know what's hurting, what brings us joy, what's most deeply valued to us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's exactly right. And, you know, it's interesting. I think a lot about that too, is some of the question we really sit with alongside communities we work with is like, whose work is this? You know, like, what's your goal and whose is it to do? And that's thinking about, I'm totally with you on there's not being anyone who's unreachable. And the whose work question is also a question of harm reduction. And it's again, I think we run a risk of, I think some of the model of the bridging world right now perpetuates the polarization that we feel when it's like, again, I mean, we see orgs that talk about, and this isn't, I don't think this is wrong, but I think when our response to, oh, this type of polarization exists, is to just get those people in a room, and again, not really tend to thoughtfulness about why or what's the intention other than like proving that we can do it. You know, I think, I don't know that that's always what our communities really need. And so, and that's really not just our model, even though we try to really think thoughtfully about when we are in spaces like whose perspective is missing and how might that person's perspective sharpen this discussion, and how might we be able to bring that perspective to bear on the conversation we're having as well.
Yeah. And it also speaks to, I'm remembering a conversation I've had with some folks that do trust building around racial justice. And that often what they had found in the 20 or so years of doing that work was that often white audiences would come in looking for relationships, whereas African-American and Black audiences would come in looking for actions, like, let's do something, like, yo, like, there's things to be done. And so like just getting folks in the room was not gonna, there was still people moving past each other. And so it really brings to point to me for the a quote that we include in our guidebook from a Sikh leader, Valerie Kaur, that says, revolutionary love is a wellspring of care, an awakening to the inherent dignity and beauty of others and the earth, a quieting of the ego, a way of moving through the world in a relationship, asking, what is your story? What is at stake? What is my part in your flourishing? So like, and I feel like that question really asks us, like, what is at stake in these projects and in these dinners?
Yeah. I think, you know, we would really kind of push back against the idea that we're bridging for bridging's sake, you know, that, and it's to the point you articulated, that we're not going to solve all the things over a one-time dinner. There are certainly things that are possible over a one-time dinner, like some of that practice we might be doing, like if I'm able to have a conversation with someone who holds identities or perspectives that someone else I know has, I might learn a way of engaging with them that teaches me to engage differently over here. You know, I think we can practice some things for a shorter amount of time that might give us some sort of North Star about our ways of relating, but I also think it can uncover the realities of our experiences such that it tells us what we need to do to build communities where everyone can flourish. And so I think a lot about, you know, the relationship between relationship building and culture change and systems change. And to me, a couple of things are at stake in that is, you know, we worked with a community a couple of years ago that was named the worst place in the country for African Americans to live. And they felt both the mayor's office invited us to do a series of work with them. And they both felt the kind of urgency of needing to respond to that, and the like, how do we slow down enough to get a real sense about how racial inequity is landing on the bodies of the people in our neighborhoods here, not just what the national narrative is. And so we did 6 months of dinners there where we kind of unpacked and uncovered stories and themes, and then came up with policy recommendations out of that unpacking. And then some of the people that went through those dinners were tasked with helping to implement those policy recommendations. And it was hard. It's really hard to do that type of work together long term. But what happened was, because they had done 6 months of deep conversation with each other, of deep listening, of getting used to a frame that they were all familiar with, they knew when things got really tense or difficult, they had the trust to kind of be able to keep moving through it. And so that's the other piece I think that gets lost, is it's the relationship building that tells us what needs to happen in our neighborhoods. It's the trust that helps sustain us in our working together. And so if we don't have that trust, the work that we want to do to make systems change can be threatened. And so I think about those participants, when they got to a place that they just could not move through moments of tension, they would say, all right, let's go out to dinner tonight, and like put all this aside, and like hear how each other are, and like really dig in together and be reminded of each other's humanity. And that helped them move through it, turn down the heat in a way that didn't threaten the kind of big high level policy decisions that they were trying to implement. And so I think those things are huge. It's not just let's sit down at dinner for dinner's sake, but how does dinner play a role, and how does our ability to connect across lines of difference play a role in the larger work we're trying to do to build communities that work for all of us?
Yeah. Thank you. Nina's offered a question. She's loving that there's a real focus on going deeper, going beyond the surface, beyond just the showing up to prove that you are not part of the problem. What are some tips and strategies for encouraging dinner dialogue participants to commit to practicing beyond the event? Like, how do you help people move beyond the event? You just talked about like having a series of dinners with this city. Is it that? Is it like what? What are some tips and strategies?
Yeah, thank you. I think certainly we begin by telling people that's our intention. So, there's no pretenses there. There's no surprises. We tell people that we hope that what they're experiencing is instructive for what, and has invitation in it. And we try to create some real space for folks to sense what their own invitation might be. Perhaps they want to maintain a deeper relationship with someone who is there. Perhaps it made them think about somebody that wasn't in the room that they want to strike up a conversation with. So we try to do some prompting of that sort, and to kind of give people the space to pay attention to where invitation might be for them, instead of us kind of being prescriptive about that. I also think that everything that happens at a dinner is good data for us about where we need to go next. So if a dinner is horrible, it might tell us that we're out of practice having this type of conversation, and so we might need to do it again. Or it might tell us that, hey, these people in the room really weren't ready. And so we need to kind of create a space where they can be skilled up in their own readiness around conversation like this. Or it might be that like, hey, at our table, we realized that all of us felt like there weren't a lot of spaces that we could ask questions about folks from other religions. And so we want to like be committed to being people that each other can ask. And so I think there's something about creating the conditions after a dinner that allows individuals to really mine the experience for data about what can be a next step for them, but also to gather the folks who kind of helped you put it on, to be like, how'd that go? How do we debrief? What does this tell us about what might be next? I worked with an interfaith group in Northern Virginia that did a series of people suppers as well they also did them around racial equity. And they kind of named on the outset that they wanted to be poised in relationship with each other, that if something were to come to the Northern Virginia neighborhoods that threatened racial equity there, they wanted to be able to respond in a unified front. And what it came after the series of dinners is that they did a series of dinners together, and then they set up a calendar for the following year of things happening in each other's congregations that they could all go to. And so they committed to that. And that was that series happened in 2020. And a couple of weeks ago, a Black man was killed by the police not far from where those faith communities are located. And those faith community members are the ones responding and they are meeting with local government, they're meeting with state government, they're kind of tag teaming, like, we're going to show up in all these different ways. And I think that, again, it was very intentional on the front end that we're going to build relationships here that might not have, we might not do a ton immediately after, but we're inviting everyone here to be committed to heeding a call if we need to be able to show up together, and they're doing that. And so I think there's a lot of different, I think there's a lot of work to be done on the front end to think about what's our hope for this particular group? What do we want this group to be able to do together beyond the dinner itself? And how do we just be really transparent about that?
Yeah, and I think there's that example you give. There's Coleyville, Texas, when the folks at the synagogue were held hostage by the man. There's also the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, when that event happened, that there was the rupture of the violence, but the response after of the community of people of different faiths and none showed how much work had been done before the rupture, before that violent moment.
Oh yeah.
To start building those relationships. So like with Coleyville, those like the Muslim and the Jewish and the Christian leaders had like their clergy groups, those like lunches that clergy get together sometimes. And sometimes they really only talk about like the football game or like what's the weather like, or like so on, like, it's nothing quote unquote important. And yet it's laying the groundwork for relationships so that when the important things come up, you, like you said, you have that trust built. It's not just the relationship, it's the trust that comes along with that.
Yeah, this group in Northern Virginia, it's a kind of an interesting chain of events. After the Mother Emanuel shooting, and there was a clergy member in Charlottesville, Virginia, who was like, I don't know who I would call if someone showed up and fired shots in my church. I don't know which of my neighbors I would call. And so he started a clergy collective in Charlottesville, Virginia, an interfaith clergy collective. And basically we need to be able to call each other. And then the Unite the Right rally showed up a couple of years later. And all of the pictures you see of the counter protest are those clergy. And it's an interfaith group, and they showed up together. And so then this clergy group in Northern Virginia, when the Virginia governors, the photos surfaced of Governor Ralph Northam in blackface, when that happened, they were like, we should be in relationship to each other. And then met with the Charlottesville clergy group. And they're the ones who said to this Virginia clergy group, you really need to be in relationship, because it's something's going to happen in your town and you've got to be ready. And now they're responding to this issue of police brutality. And so, it's exactly what you said, but this is the clergy group in Northern Virginia has been meeting pretty consistently. But what I liked about the series too, is the series that we did with them was it designed to make it so it wasn't just the interfaith clergy who knew each other, but so their people could know each other too. And so their people could be called upon. And so the clergy meets monthly, and they had a room of 150 people from each of their congregation, 150 total representatives from 20 different congregations, who had committed to, I would answer a call if we needed to show up collectively. And so, I'm so moved by that, because again, it's not the story of what happened at the dinner table. It's the commitment and practice to being in relationship with each other that prepares us for doing life together beyond the dinner table space.
Yeah, and I see we're just 5 minutes from the top of the hour, and we had a couple more questions, but like, I feel like we got through like so much. Like, thank you so much for this really rich conversation and just showing what's really at stake in this type of work. That it's not just about having a Muslim friend or having a Jewish friend or having an atheist friend or anything like it's about like deepening trust within our communities so that we can respond in moments of challenge as well as moments of joy. Like I love that, I was at an Eid party on Monday, and it's just so much joy. Like we had the overlapping of holy days this spring as well as last spring, and that won't happen again until 2054, just so you know. But there's those moments of joy that I feel like it's when we show up in joy with each other, as well as in hardship, is when we really see the fullness of each other's humanity. So I'd love to, like, our final question to ask, like, what has inspired you in this work?
Oh, I think it's irresistible. I think it's absolutely the joy that keeps me in it, because once you realize what's possible for your own kind of the richness of relationship that's possible, it's like I can't help it. I have to keep doing it. I have to keep inviting people into it. And um yeah, there's something about that really keeps me showing up, and the chance it is to kind of, I've done some of these in my own town, and walking through my town and knowing the owners of the different shops or the people who work at different places, and knowing their names of their children, or the moments that they're afraid, or the things that they're celebrating, is something that just keeps me. And they know those about me. It's not just I know them now, but they know me. And yeah, I think that I don't know, I can't think of a good story off the top of my head, but the joy of it and the irresistibility of it, because it's invited me to see the richness of what's possible, and really commit to doing this thing alongside each other. And that um I'm like, I can't go back. Can't go
Yeah.
back.
Yeah. And like for me, I think when people sometimes ask if this work is hard, because I'm constantly talking about discrimination and violence. And I will say, yes, that is very hard. It's heartbreaking. And it's sometimes angering, and so many grief and all the different human emotions in that. But what I've learned, and what really our seminary, Kay and I went to seminary together as well, both graduated from Wesley Theological Seminary here in DC, is that, if I as a Christian am praying to love with the heart of God and to see with the eyes of God, then I will see all the beauty in this world, as well as all the ways that we fall short. And that my heart will be simultaneously broken as well as healed, of like, oh my God, there's like so much, like such small things we can do for each other to like brighten each other's day and to bring healing and hope. And some simultaneously, there's such small things that can do the reverse, the inverse of that. And so like, my hope is meeting folks like people that are watching this, people that do this work, whether it's just having a conversation with your neighbor, whether it's you like leading this work around the country, or Lennon or Jen, the rest of the folks on your team. And so it's people deciding that there's a better way that we can do this life, that we can build community.
Yeah.
And so
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and encourage you to check out our Ramadan resources, including the Interfaith Iftar guidebook that Kay and I and our teams worked on, as well as our Ramadan road trip video series and discussion guides. All of these can be used all year long for hosting engaging spaces and conversations, not just during Ramadan, although that's a very special time. I also want to invite you all to join us next month, June 15th, for a workshop on using the social change ecosystem to address anti-Muslim discrimination with Deepa Iyer, Senior Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Building Movement Project. It's a really amazing model that she has come up with, and a way to guide communities to better understand what is my role, what is my part to play in helping build those beloved communities, and helping build those communities where all of us can have dignity and flourish together. And so thanks everybody so much, and we hope you all have a good day.